There's always one team. There's always one team that has the potential to just create nightmare Kolas scenarios or dream scenarios for a variety of teams around the NCAA. This year, we think it's going to be.
Hello, and welcome to the Stride Report podcast. I am Ben Weissel, and joining me, as always, Garrett Allen. How's it going, man?
Ben, I feel like for all the times that you've been ill, right, and have still made it on the pod, I now have a renewed sense of appreciation, and I've been humbled as I now have the sniffles, and I will now try to get through this podcast. It certainly gives me greater perspective, and of course, you are now, much more vulnerable to all of that because you have children and a family, right? I isolate myself, and I still get sick, so it's a very humbling moment here today, but I will power through because I love the audience. I love you as we try to get today's episode off the ground. A very important episode.
Yeah, and hey, I appreciate you battling through. We'll put up. We'll have to have the social media team put together like a flu game graphic or something for you. But yeah, definitely important episode. One of I think our favorites to do because I think this is where we provide a lot of value that not a lot of other sites do provide, and we get you guys ready for regionals. We're not going to talk too much about the individual races, who's going to finish second, who's going to finish first. We'll talk about that a little bit, but what we're here to prime you guys for is what to look for in the race results when it matters to who is going to qualify for the national meet. So, look at the Southeast Regional because these set of results could mean a lot of things for the Mountain Regional and so on and so forth. And this, to me, this is the most fun of the regional meets. The best teams aren't usually going all out. They've already got nationals sewed up. It's hard to learn a lot from the best individuals and the best teams, but you can kind of at the beginning of the day start to piece together who is going to make the national meet before even the last region finishes, which is I think in my mind the most fun.
Yeah, and it's also like fun to be like, hey, team X in whatever region should be rooting for or against team Y in a completely different region. These two teams couldn't possibly be more different, and yet they are so intertwined, and one little thing can change so much. So as we're doing this, if you have the ability and if you have the availability to do so, what might help is going to collegexc.com. We've worked with them just in terms of, trying to just chat with them and using their calculator to figure out how the Kolas qualifying system works and what orders we can do. So if you are able to, following along with collegexc.com, very, very helpful and can certainly make this a little bit more of a fun follow along experiment for you guys. Before we begin, ratings and reviews, none there. Hey, work with us here. We're trying our best. All right. 5-star ratings and reviews on Apple, Spotify. Subscribe as well. Subscribe. Hit that subscribe button. You'll know because you'll want to know when these episodes come out now, especially as the postseason arrives, especially with so much time sensitivity coming with these postseason meets. But Ben, here's what we're going to do today. We're going to, like you said, chat about the regional meets, but I'm going to give out our projected regional finishes, and then we'll talk about some of the consequences, some of the flips, what we could see there. So I'll just read off our first few teams in each region, just based on what we think are relevant teams, and we'll go into it. And we'll start with the men's side. All right, we'll start with the men. So in the Great Lakes region, I've got Michigan State, Butler, Notre Dame, Wisconsin, Michigan in that order. Mid-Atlantic, I've got Princeton and Georgetown in that order. Midwest, I've got Oklahoma State, Iowa State, Oklahoma, Tulsa, Missouri, Loyola, Minnesota in that order. In the Mountain region, I've got New Mexico, I've got Colorado, I've got BYU, I've got Northern Arizona, I have Air Force in that order. I believe I also have Utah Valley, I want to say. Wyoming, Wyoming, then Utah State, 6 and 7. Northeast region, I've got Syracuse, Harvard, Iona, Cornell, Yale. South region, I've got Alabama, I've got Georgia, I've got, I guess we have Lipscomb there, Middle Tennessee State, and Ole Miss. That's an interesting region that we'll chat about later. South Central, Arkansas, Tulane, Texas A&M, and Texas. For Southeast region, Virginia, Wake Forest, Virginia Tech, UNC, Eastern Kentucky, Furman, Louisville, and in the West region, Oregon, Washington State, Washington State, California Baptist, Stanford, Boise State, Gonzaga, Portland, Cal Poly, and Washington in that order. So I know that was probably a lot. If you're following along, feel free to pause and you can follow along with us. But Ben, in terms of what we think some of the more dynamic and impactful regions in terms of their finishes could be, what do you foresee that being on the men's side?
I think it has to be the South region, and this is what again, maybe not the highest likelihood of something happening, but changes to this region affect a lot of other regions, and I think that's what gets things really, really interesting. Right now, as you mentioned, we have Alabama and Georgia taking those first two spots. I think Alabama is in a different class than everyone else in this region. I think Georgia is probably in that second tier, and then there's everyone else, right? Lipscomb, MTSU, Ole Miss, I think all have outside shots of maybe taking that second spot should Georgia stumble. Again, I would have Georgia as heavy favorites to be in the second automatic qualifying spot. But if they do not, they have enough Kolas points to get in on their own if they finish third. There's really not many scenarios where Georgia does not qualify as long as they finish in the top three, right? And I think based off of their season, you would imagine they would. Now, what gets really interesting is if they do not get in one of those first two automatic qualifying spots. If they finish third, let's say Lipscomb finishes second. This is where things get really, really fascinating because if Georgia finishes second, you would see 5 teams qualify from the Southeast. You would see Virginia, Wake Forest, Virginia Tech, North Carolina, and Eastern Kentucky. Great. And the Midwest, you would see 6 teams qualify. Oklahoma State, Iowa State, Oklahoma, Tulsa, Missouri, Loyola. You simply swap in our projections Georgia and Lipscomb. Instead of the list of teams that I just mentioned in the Midwest, you have 2 teams. You have
Mhm.
Oklahoma State and Iowa State. Oklahoma, Tulsa, Missouri, Loyola, all gone out of the national meet. Sayonara. In the Midwest, you are the biggest Georgia Bulldogs fans out there. You are
Hmm.
cheering for them. You have you bought a bulldog to walk with you for the rest of the week because you just want to remember Georgia needs to finish second. The beneficiaries of this, who are cheering against the Bulldogs, who have scratched out their Bulldog stickers, that is Louisville and Furman. They get in. There are 7 teams now that qualify out of the Southeast. And Air Force as well gets in, and it's the 5th Mountain team. So again, I wanted to start with this one because the ramifications are massive. Again, unlikely scenario, but man, it's wild how one team's performance can make a Missouri, a Loyola, who have had fantastic seasons, who have
Awesome.
performed so well, just all that goes out the door. And instead, you get teams like Louisville and Furman who haven't had, I think, as good of seasons objectively. Now they are qualifying due to the Kolas scenario. So, thoughts on that one? Because there's a lot of moving pieces here.
Yeah, a lot of moving pieces. I think what's interesting is that like the orders in some of these regions still matter a lot. Like,
Yes.
for instance, we're talking about like Lipscomb getting second, right? In a scenario where again, we're pretty sure Alabama, Georgia are probably going to take that one too, right? Lipscomb, let's say they get second, right? And then let's say it's Missouri that gets third in the Midwest region, which is possible, right? Let's say
Mhm.
Oklahoma stumbles, right? It's possible Missouri beats Oklahoma. It's possible Missouri beats Tulsa. It's possible, even expected, that Missouri beats Lipscomb, right? And if Missouri were to get third, Missouri gets in that scenario, right?
Mhm.
So like the order in which that Midwest region happens begins to have some significant impact on the rest of that kind of the output of the Kolas scenario, which is a really fascinating development. And Eastern Kentucky is kind of saved in that scenario still. Eastern Kentucky, you'll notice, being kind of the one team that's on the fringe if a lot of these back and forth on and off scenarios happen, right? Some may say, well, that's not realistic. Well, that's not realistic. Well, one scenario may not be realistic, but if I gave you 10 options for one of those scenarios to happen, the chances, in theory go up. So, yeah, I respect the South region in terms of what it could do chaos wise. I do not think for me it is the most dynamic. And I think that's because what we could see in the South Central region
Mm,
is really fascinating for me, right? We have Arkansas and Tulane as the top two auto qualifiers projected right now, and there's a good chance that that happens. But I think there is a greater chance of that top two being shaken up in the South Central region
yep.
than the top two being shaken up in the South region, right? Now, are the end results as chaotic as maybe we see in the South? Maybe not. But let's say Arkansas gets third, right? Arkansas, which we have a team that we have critiqued and criticized this season quite heavily, I have to add, despite their struggles, if they got third in their region, they would still get in, at least in our current scenario.
Mhm.
And that takes Eastern Kentucky out of the mix. And that's pretty surprising, right? Texas A&M and Tulane in the top two, right? That would take them out. Tulane, if they get third, well, guess what? They get in. Eastern Kentucky, you're out. Texas A&M though, if they get third, nope, Eastern Kentucky gets in over you, right? So Eastern Kentucky, what I'm basically saying right now is no one dislikes Texas A&M more than Eastern Kentucky. Eastern Kentucky wants Texas A&M to struggle greatly. They do. And Eastern Kentucky, let's say they fall back beyond where we have them projected in fifth place and they get six, right? And now all of a sudden they more likely have to get in. Well, you'd be like, well, surely it's just, then Texas A&M. No, it's Minnesota in the Midwest region. They get in. So you can see how, in my opinion, the South Central region, which I think is frankly more volatile than the South region, Eastern Kentucky is going to be heavily monitoring the South Central region. And who knows, maybe Eastern Kentucky gets fourth, maybe they get third, and maybe this is a moot point, right? But with how shaky Eastern Kentucky has been this season, are you confident that they're going to get fourth place and beat one of Virginia Tech, Wake Forest, Virginia, or North Carolina? I'm not.
No, I mean, I don't think you can feel great about Eastern Kentucky in general, right? I don't think you feel like they're solidly in that fifth spot either. I mean, they have yet to put the pieces together in a big way at a big meet. And I think obviously they have all the talent in the world, but they needed them all to run fairly well. They can't afford any DNFs, that's for sure. And otherwise, they are going to fall, and they're going to fall hard. And so, yeah, I absolutely think Eastern Kentucky is someone that the Minnesotas, the Air Forces of the world are going to be cheering against to give another qualifying spot to one of those teams.
Yeah, and listen, like I said, if Eastern Kentucky gets fourth, this is all a pretty moot point, right? I don't
Yeah.
want to, exaggerate the drama behind this, and then it just becomes a moot point because that could happen. But the fact is that if Eastern Kentucky can't beat any of the four teams in the Southeast that I already mentioned, it's a little bit over there. So,
It's
not over.
interesting,
I
and
should say.
we hadn't
Go ahead.
talked about this, but Eastern Kentucky finishing fourth, all our other projections staying the same. Do you
Mhm.
see what? So we see Air Force does qualify, and Loyola gets knocked out if Eastern Kentucky finishes ahead of North Carolina, which again could happen. I think Eastern Kentucky is
Sure.
the more talented team than North Carolina. They haven't really shown that to be the case consistently, but there's a world where Eastern Kentucky does finish fourth, and that takes Loyola, if they finish sixth in the Midwest, out, and Air Force, if they finish fifth, in.
Which is pretty wild because I think we came into this conversation, you and I, we had run some scenarios over the last two nights, and we had said like, hey, Loyola, we think of them as kind of like a fringe team. They're actually like in a pretty good spot, even if they
Mhm.
fall, back to sixth place in that Midwest region. Eastern Kentucky is ultimately, I think, what we're getting at here. They are the catalyst of chaos. There's always one team. There's always one team that has the potential to just create nightmare Kolas scenarios or dream scenarios for a variety of teams around the NCAA. This year, we think it's going to be Eastern Kentucky. And that's a pretty crazy scenario. What are some push scenarios, maybe in original projections, that you maybe see happening that maybe aren't as apparent right off the cuff?
Well, let's stick with Loyola and Eastern Kentucky. If Loyola finishes seventh, if they fall back, Minnesota finishes sixth. With our current projections, again, Eastern Kentucky finishing fifth, all the other results occurring as you laid out. Loyola pushes Minnesota in, and now 7 teams qualify out of the Midwest, and Eastern Kentucky again is out. So again, there are some scenarios where Loyola is out, but even if they perform poorly, if things break right or as predicted, they could still get in, finishing seventh. And now, again, there's 3 teams that seem to be connected in all these scenarios, right? Loyola, Air Force, Eastern Kentucky. It doesn't seem like more than one of these teams is going, or more than 2 of these teams are going to get in, right? One
Agree.
is always going to be left out, sometimes 2, right? Depending on the scenario. So that was one push scenario that really came to mind because, again, it's involving the same 3 teams that we've been talking about.
Yeah, I like that. I like how you phrase that, right? Like Air Force, Loyola, and Eastern Kentucky are like very heavily like there could only be one, right? Like not only one, maybe there's two, right? But like one of those three teams is at least going to be upset with how Friday ends.
Yep.
They are, and that's going to be really interesting. So yeah, I think those three teams, like you said, are kind of connected. Minnesota, I think, has a little more life than maybe we realized
Mm-hmm.
in some of these scenarios because there are very niche, I should add, but there are scenarios where they get seventh and they get in, right? Which is in
Mm-hmm.
this Midwest region pretty crazy to say out loud. One of the push scenarios that I could like kind of like happen, I could kind of see happening. Look at the West region. Personally, and I've said this since the beginning of the season, hasn't fully held true. I really like Boise State. I really like the Boise State men. I don't know why I can't quit them, but I do. Right now, we have them projected to get fifth, and in our current projections, and in most projections, they don't get in. They don't. Long story short, if Boise State gets fifth, they can't get in on their own. It's highly unlikely, right? You would need some like utter beyond chaos for that to happen. But let's say in Oregon, a Washington State, CBU, Stanford, rest some top guys. Maybe they're like, yeah, we kind of got this. They go on cruise control. Boise State gets really good, just has a really good day all of a sudden, and they get fourth. And let's say Boise State just beats Stanford theoretically. Stanford pushes them in. And Ben, who is the team on the chopping block in that sense?
As always, Eastern Kentucky.
Eastern Kentucky, at least in our scenario, right? But let's say there's a push scenario in there where we say, hey, Eastern Kentucky, you get fourth. Well, then they're in. They actually don't get pushed in. Boise State gets fourth. They get pushed in. The drop, the away, the lost bid, the at large bid, lost at bid would go to Loyola. Loyola would not have a bid to get in, and neither would Air Force or Minnesota. So I would just monitor Boise State. Boise State potentially finding their way in for a push does further complicate this picture, and I don't think that's an unrealistic scenario.
And I think the overarching theme that probably you guys are sensing as we're talking about this is this looks like a fairly chalk like set of scenarios. Like the regional predictions, there have been years where Garrett and I will argue about, hey, like what should the projections be? This year, I don't really have any big disagreements with Garrett on the projections that we have in the region because you look at a lot of these, it's very cut and dry. There's some scenarios like we just mentioned where, hey, maybe these teams could get flipped, but it's fairly chalk. Like in the mountain, you know who the top 4 teams are going to be. In Great Lakes, you know who the top 5 teams are going to be. And there's more regions than ever, even with 32 teams qualifying for the national meet, that are only getting 2 teams into the national meet. The Mid-Atlantic, the South Central, the Northeast, all very likely to get 2 teams unless there is a significant upset to one of those top 2 teams. And again, we talked about South Central and South. There's varying levels of possibility of an upset there. but the bids are very consolidated in 3 or 4 regions this year, and that's why we keep talking about them, because those are the only ones that are going to affect. Like, sorry, we haven't talked about you guys Northeast, Syracuse and Harvard. I don't see that being disrupted, right? And so there aren't a whole lot of scenarios that we're going to go through because we just feel like that's very, very unlikely.
Fun fact though, just to play just to play the chaos card here. If you get Yeah, that's insane. If you just, reset all of our original projections to how we think they are, and Iona, let's say, beats Harvard, right? Then
Oh my gosh.
yeah, so the Midwest would just have the top 2 autos, assuming it's being Oklahoma State and Iowa State, which we're assuming it will, right? And then no one else out of the Midwest region gets in. The West region would get Boise State pushed in by Gonzaga, and Eastern Kentucky would also get in, and so would Air Force, but the Midwest would fall victim, which is a crazy thing to say. Now, is it likely that that happens? No, but like I also think there's way more less likely scenarios to happen in other regions for autos. Like I don't see anyone beating Princeton and Georgetown for the Mid Atlantic
Yeah.
autos. I don't.
That gets pretty wild too if like you slide in Navy or Villanova into one of those spots. But again, probably not worth getting into because again, it is just very, very unlikely. Any other teams that we should discuss here? Again, I think Great Lakes you feel pretty good about. Michigan State, Butler, Notre Dame, Wisconsin, Michigan. Like it's going to be some combination of those teams in the top five. I haven't played around, but is there any significance like to that order? I don't think that really affects anything as far as I can tell.
No, I don't think so. I'm sorry, remind me which region? It's
The Great Lakes.
Great Lakes. No,
If you
I don't
play around
think
with that, it does
I
not, as far
I
as what
don't
I'm
think
seeing.
so. No, no, not. I think Michigan could get an auto, and I don't really think it matters. It does not matter. No. So, yeah, with the Great Lakes, as long as the top 5 are the top 5 that we have projected, and I'm pretty confident it will be.
Mhm.
The Great Lakes actually has maybe the least impact relative.
Yeah,
So,
agreed.
okay, let's head to the women's side, where I will now list off again when I'm listing these teams off. These are not necessarily the teams that we have all getting in, just some the teams that we have in the region that are we think are applicable to some of these calculations. Um, excuse me. So
Could have an impact on depending on their finish. Could have an impact on the national qualifying picture.
correct, correct. So on the women's side here, Great Lakes, we've got Notre Dame, Michigan State, Wisconsin, Toledo, Ohio, Mid Atlantic, West Virginia, Penn State, Georgetown, Villanova, Princeton, Midwest, Iowa State, Western, Oklahoma State, Missouri, Minnesota, Nebraska, Mountain, BYU, Northern Arizona, New Mexico, Colorado, Utah, Air Force, Northeast, Boston College, Syracuse, Providence, Yale, Connecticut, Harvard, South, Florida, Alabama, Tennessee, Florida State, South Central, LSU, Tulane, Texas A&M, Arkansas, SMU, Texas, Southeast, NC State, North Carolina, Virginia, South Carolina, Duke, Wake Forest, Virginia Tech, Clemson, Louisville, maybe. West region, Oregon, Stanford, Washington, Washington State, Gonzaga, Boise State, CBU, Oregon State, and Cal Poly. Yeah. Ben, again, I'll ask you the same question. The region of chaos. What is the region of chaos in your mind?
I think it is probably the South Central again. I'll go back to that, and the reason why is you could see a lot of results out of here, right?
Mhm.
LSU and Texas A&M we have projected as qualifying. Tulane and Arkansas are right behind them though. None of these teams are that good, right? They're fine, but they're not the quality that we're used to seeing get automatic qualifying spots, right? And that leaves this order to be very, very open. So if we say it's LSU and Texas A&M 1-2, you get 5 teams out of the Southeast. Duke being that fifth and final spot. But if you decide, hey, we want to put in Tulane over Texas A&M, for instance. What we see is Wake Forest gets in at number 6, and you know who ends up out in this scenario? And unfortunately, in a lot of scenarios, is the Villanova women, who we have slotted in at 4th in the Mid-Atlantic. They are surprisingly in a very precarious situation. They're in our default projection, but you start to move things around. If anybody steals a spot that they're not supposed to, or there's an upset to any of the automatic qualifiers, Villanova is left out in the cold. Wake Forest is one of the beneficiaries that we could see. They're targeted to finish 6th in our projections, and there is a couple of different scenarios where they could get in. The Southeast region, and I'll let you get into this in a second, also has some very interesting machinations. Sure, we'll go with
Sure.
that. Where the order of 4, 5, 6 could play a heavy role in
Do you mean
deciding who is in.
permutations?
No, it's like it's spelled machine nations, but that's not how it's. I think it's machinations. I'm gonna
Yeah, I
I'm
think
gonna
I
have to
think I
look
get.
this up.
Yeah, okay. I just
Uh,
want to double check.
we're literate. We have degrees. I promise. Um,
Are either
but
of
yeah,
ours English degrees, by the way? I don't even I think they're all
no,
both
no,
they're both
no, no
technical in math.
chance.
Yeah.
Absolutely not. Absolutely not. No, no. And hey, look at us. Well, I'm not writing anymore, but you're doing a lot of writing.
I am.
So yeah, that the South Central is very interesting because again, we've talked about it. Arkansas hasn't been very good, but you throw Peyton Noe back in, and hey, maybe they do finish in the top 2. Again, if they finish in the top 2, it's a very similar scenario. Wake Forest gets bumped in, and Villanova gets bumped out. And only 2 teams. Really, there's only 2 teams that are going to make it out of the South Central. No team has the ability, if they fall out, to still qualify or push anybody in, but they have a big impact on what we will see out of the Mid-Atlantic and the Southeast region.
Yeah, I agree. I will make a quick note. You mentioned how, if something happens with like an auto in any region is kind of like upset, then Villanova's out. Well, it really in reality, like Villanova's actually pretty good in most auto upsets, I guess. But in the regions where it is most
Mhm.
dynamic for that to happen,
Sure.
where it's most vulnerable for that to happen, Villanova could be in trouble. Like you mentioned, that South Central region, right? Like if Villanova gets 4th and like we're very confident West Virginia's a better team. We're very
Mhm.
confident that Penn State's a better team. Georgetown just beat them at the Big East Championships. There's a very realistic possibility that Villanova gets 4th. Now, watch Georgetown like they've done in the past, rest someone, or Villanova or Penn State rest someone, right? West Virginia, maybe they do so, right? And maybe that gets in, and then you get a push scenario, and then this is all kind of moot, right? But like you mentioned, that South Central region, really dynamic. Like there's like in an absolute broadest, like crazy case scenario, there's like 6 teams in the South Central region that could get an auto. I really think that's true. And it's a crazy thing to say out loud. Now, or do like some teams have more of a chance than others? Yes. Like we mentioned, like Arkansas, what happens if they were to suddenly and unexpectedly bring back Peyton Noe? This changes things pretty dramatically, right? So, for me, the
Sorry, before you go on,
yeah, go
one thing
ahead.
I should note, if Villanova does beat Georgetown, Georgetown's 4th. Georgetown is pretty well protected
Yeah.
about of getting in. So like there, all these scenarios that we're talking about, they would be able to fend off the Wake Forests of the world and still qualify. So if Georgetown's sitting fairly pretty, they finish in the top 4, they're in. It's Villanova that's more of in the precarious situation of being 4th. That's going to leave the door open for some other scenarios.
Yeah, and I 100% agree, and that's a great point, right? Where it's like that Southeast region, that 6th place team, we think it's like maybe going to be Wake Forest and Duke, right? Like that's where things get tricky. Where if Villanova does get 3rd, which again is possible,
Mhm.
if that happens, then like the Southeast region, basically, whoever that 6th place team is like, man, I hope Villanova struggles. And I think people are like, man, Villanova, like, I really thought that they did pretty well. Like, what kind of happened here? And they did run well this season, right? But when you look at like who they beat, right? Like they ran really well um Paul Short, but like their outing at pre-nationals like wasn't that productive in terms of who they beat, right? So and you push them back to 4th, and all of a sudden things get tricky. It does limit them a little bit there. So Something to consider on that end. For me, the most dynamic region, I think, in my mind, not necessarily in terms of like what we could see the finish of. Well, maybe I guess, but like I guess not in terms of like what could impact other regions, but in terms of how it impacts their own. That's the Southeast region, which I've already touched on a little bit here. The Southeast region, yeah, like there's NC State in North Carolina, right? And maybe even Virginia, you feel pretty good about getting somewhere in the top three. Maybe Virginia gets fourth, but like even if Virginia does get fourth, they're still in a pretty good spot, right? But South Carolina, Duke, and Wake Forest are all teams that have either appeared or are currently listed in our top 25 team rankings. There is a very good chance that at least one of those teams does not make the national meet, which would be pretty substantial for a team that we have
Mhm.
listed in our top 25, right? Like, for instance, think you take our current projections as listed. Wake Forest does not get in sixth place, right? But let's say Duke gets sixth, Wake Forest gets fifth, and South Carolina gets fourth. Well, now Duke doesn't get in. Okay, well, let's say Wake Forest gets sixth place, South Carolina gets fifth, and Duke gets fourth. Well, South Carolina gets pushed in by Wake Forest, and now all six teams in that Southeast region are in, and Villanova is out, right? Like just the order within those latter like 4, 5, 6 spots of the Southeast region impacts whether a fourth place Villanova team gets in. Like that's pretty dynamic, right? What if it was to be Duke in sixth, South Carolina in fifth, and Wake Forest in fourth? Well, then guess what? That's another scenario where South Carolina gets pushed in and Villanova is left out. So it's really dynamic in those 4, 5, 6 spots of the Southeast region. I think it's really going to be heavily dependent on how this impacts Villanova should they get fourth in the Mid Atlantic region. And yeah, it's a shock. It's a shockingly well, it's a region that shockingly doesn't have a lot of Kolas stability.
Well, and the interesting part and, the great thing about the collegeXC.com is you can quickly look at, hey, who's in and who's out, and then you can click on, like, the selection details, and you can see, hey, how many points was each of these teams, like, projected to get in terms of cool loss points. And it is so, vastly different from the men and women's side. You have a Villanova team who, in a lot of scenarios, has 5 or so points at least, and that doesn't guarantee them a spot in. Whereas on the men's side, you have 1 point, you have a shot. Like if you have the tiebreakers, right? So there have been a lot more competition between the automatic qualifying teams and the rest of the NCAA than there has been on the men's side, where there just has not been very many points given out.
Good
And
point.
that's why we talk about Villanova. They've had a good season. They have had a good season, but so has a lot of these other teams, like the Wake Forest, like the South Carolinas, where they have accumulated a lot of points as we go along. Any other region that you kind of played around with and saw some effects to the rest of the NCAA?
Well, first off, great point you just made there about like the Col because I'm thinking about their poll short run. I'm like, well, they beat an A team Penn State,
Yeah.
they beat an A team Georgetown, they beat a Texas A&M team, right? Like maybe they got another point somewhere at pre nationals, even if it wasn't the most exciting field in retrospect. And I'm thinking, sitting there thinking, like, man, is there really? Yeah, and it turns out that even in the women's like regional meets this year you can have a lot of points, like a lot of points, and still be on the fringes. Whereas the men's team, it's like, hey, we got like maybe 2 points. It's like we're in, awesome. Like that's not always that cut and dry, but yeah, pretty interesting. For me, I think it just kind of goes back to Boise State. I don't want to be the Boise State like fanboy over here, but Boise State women right now we have them getting 6 in the West region, and right now they're not getting in. And if you have them just simply getting above Gonzaga, guess what? They're simply not in. But if they get fourth, well then they're pushed. Excuse me, then they're pushed in, right? That's kind of an interesting scenario. Boise State kind of really needs a big race, but again, what happens if someone rests, right? Minnesota, the Minnesota women, where I think like you and I, despite our being down on them this year, we're like quietly holding out hope. We're like, what if they just like what if they beat Missouri? in the Midwest region. Well, if that were to happen,
It's not
Iowa
good.
State would not get in. Or I'm sorry, Iowa State would get in, Northwestern would get in, assuming there are automatic qualifiers. Oklahoma State would
They
not
have
get.
no points. They have hardly any points.
That's the caveat here. Here's the craziest thing that I think we're all kind of missing. If Minnesota gets fourth and presumably beats Missouri or Oklahoma State, we're assuming that's one of the teams that they would have to beat to get fourth place, right? And again, is it a stretch? Yes, but is it unrealistic? No, not at all. If that happens, Oklahoma State, a team that we have listed somewhere in our top 15, close to our top 10, does not get into the national meet. And this kind of happened, I think, maybe last or 2 years ago, somewhere, I want to say, to an Alabama team
Mhm.
where they didn't really race outside of their own home course, or they didn't really race super competitive meets, or maybe the one race they did, it just didn't turn out to be that great of a field in retrospect. And they didn't get in. It happened a couple years ago. That same scenario could happen to Oklahoma State. And if that happens, then Wake Forest is the benefactor. And the crazy part, Tennessee in the South region gets in.
Yeah, we haven't talked about Tennessee at all, but
That's crazy.
there is an avenue to 3 teams out of the South region, which is very interesting. And if you say, "Hey, what happens if Florida State finishes 3rd and we have Minnesota win?" Well, you know what happens in that
Minnesota
scenario?
gets fourth. Excuse
Yeah,
me.
4th. Sorry. Yeah,
Sorry, go ahead.
excuse me. Yeah, Minnesota 4th. Tennessee pushes in Florida State. 4
Woo!
teams get out of the South. Wake Forest in 6th place is out. And of course, only 2 teams out of the Midwest qualify. So the South is really praying that just things go wonky out in the Midwest, because that should open up some possibilities for them. And yeah, Oklahoma State has to be like, their mindset is they have to beat Northwestern, because if they don't beat Northwestern and they don't get one of those top 2 spots, then like they're just beholden to what happens behind them. And that is not a good position to be in, right?
That's
Where
a
you're
scary
cheering
realization.
for Missouri. Yeah, and that was, and I'm glad we're getting to this, because I had written this down. I'm like, Oklahoma State is not in a secure spot at all. We've talked about Villanova. We've
Yeah.
talked about like the Wake Forest. They're on the fringe, but Oklahoma State, if they don't run well, they have no backstop. So it gets really interesting really fast out of the Midwest regional if Oklahoma State does not finish in the top 3, or if Missouri does not finish in the top 4.
If you were making the official predictions for the site, let's say you have Iowa State and one of the top 2 auto qualifiers. Who are you giving the second auto qualifier to? Is it Oklahoma State or is it Northwestern?
I think it's Northwestern. They've been more consistent all year.
Yeah.
X factor here is Jep Curry for Oklahoma State. If she runs she doesn't have to run like herself, but if she runs like a low stick, then I think Oklahoma State has a shot, just because of their firepower
Yep.
over Northwestern. But Northwestern, their ability to pack up in a big meet like this, and their consistency, I like them to be able to just put down a solid marker that Oklahoma State's going to have to put out a very, very good performance to beat.
So the biggest agent of chaos is basically Minnesota, right, in the Midwest region, because that would create tons of craziness.
Yep.
But in terms of like who the most volatile agent of chaos is that Wake Forest, I guess? Is that the equivalent?
I mean, I think it could be like Texas A&M, right?
Sure.
Like, depending on if they finish in the top 2 or not, that has some knock-on effects to Villanova and that 6th team in the Southeast. I think that's like that second spot in the South Central is, I mean, really the top 2 spots. I don't think anybody's feeling like, yes, LSU is definitely making it. They should, like compared to the teams that they're racing against. But there is a lot of permutations in the South Central that affect, obviously, the 2 regions that we've mentioned.
Yeah, for me, I still think it's Wake Forest, just because like Wake Forest wasn't great at ACCs at all. Like they got ninth, I want to say, right? And you kind of like look at the Southeast regions, very similar field to ACCs. It's not all that different,
Yep.
right? You got South Carolina thrown in there, but that's about like the only real difference. If they get 7th and let's say fall behind like a Clemson or Virginia Tech or whoever, well, then guess what? Tennessee in that third place spot gets in. That may be the Tennessee's clearest path to get in, which
Wait,
is
so if you
crazy.
have who do you have at 6 then in that scenario?
Virginia Tech.
And okay. So you have Virginia
Well,
Tech at 6 and that gets Tennessee in?
yeah,
Interesting.
yeah. If you take in the southeast region, it goes NC State, North Carolina, Virginia, South Carolina, Duke, and then Virginia Tech and Wake Forest. Whereas then, oh, I'm sorry, I'm talking about the women. I take that back. I think I had Arkansas in the autos. Never mind. Does not do that.
Okay.
That was with Arkansas in the South Central. I apologize. That makes more sense. Okay, never mind then. But yeah, so
Yeah, I'm struggling to see like yeah, if Wake Forest doesn't run well, I'm not seeing any team that beats them having a significant impact on what we're going to see from the rest of the regions. It's just they're just not going to qualify. Um,
which I think what
so
who so then who's the benefactor in that case? Is that Gonzaga? Like, you see what I mean? Like, well, I guess it doesn't
if
matter if they're six, then they still don't get in our current default
right,
projections. So
exactly. Yeah,
I guess it doesn't
Villanova
really
just stays
matter.
in. Yeah.
Yeah, I guess it doesn't
Yeah.
really matter. That makes more sense. Okay. Ben, it's the craziness, man. It's the craziness. So, um, listen, on the site, go check it out. We'll have our official projections some point this week. This episode's coming out Tuesday night, Wednesday, and we'll likely have our official projections out maybe Wednesday, maybe Thursday. Kind of depends on timing and availability. But Ben, anything further on these women's Kolas projections?
No, no. This was fun as always. It does seem like there's a little less chance of like the huge scale chaos that
I
we've
agree.
seen in years past. But hey, we laid out the scenarios. If something goes weird early on in the day, maybe the Mid Atlantic is Villanova in third and Georgetown's in fourth, and then it's like, all right, those spots are pretty entrenched. Someone's losing a spot. Then you already know what to be on the lookout for when we get to the West Regional and these last couple of regions that get run. So make sure you guys are following along. Use the College XC site, which is fantastic as you go throughout the day. It's what we'll be using as we're tracking all the results coming in. But yeah, I think that's all I got.
Awesome. Subscription, rating and review, subscribe on the podcast as well. Shout out to Believe, our new podcast partner. Happy to partner with them. And that's it. Stay tuned. That's all I got, Ben.
All right, Garrett. Well, until next week, I'll talk to you.
I'll talk to you.